unacceptable brutality, which is compounded by unspeakable atrocities, notably murders, the rape of at least 200 women, massacres, forced conscription of children taken to Rutshuru training camps and others. By actively supporting the armed groups, Rwanda is directly responsible for the violations, which has exposed civilians to unspeakable suffering. Peacekeeping forces with the Security Council mandate, particularly MONUSCO, as well as humanitarian facilities, have been targeted on a number of occasions. This has undermined their ability to protect civilians in a hostile environment. We also deplore the attacks against the SADC regional forces, which have been working tirelessly for regional stability. President, in view of this situation, the Democratic Republic of Congo calls for the establishment of an International Commission of Inquiry to examine human rights violations committed in my country. This commission must have a mandate to establish the truth as to who is responsible for these crimes and to provide recommendations for holding them accountable. We also call for tangible measures to be adopted to prevent future violations of this nature. It's vital that we strengthen monitoring and early warning mechanisms and to ensure better coordination between MONUSCO, Congolese security forces and regional actors in order to protect civilians and prevent further escalations of violence. Furthermore, it's vital today that we ensure immediate and unfettered humanitarian access in order to better care for the thousands of injured, evacuate the most seriously injured, and reduce the risk of the spread of epidemics such as cholera and mpox in a city which has already been traumatized and where corpses litter many streets. We firmly reject the involvement of certain states, particularly Rwanda. They've provided logistical, military and financial support to armed groups operating on our territory. Rwanda's support for M23, which has been documented on a number of occasions, including by the UN Security Council group of experts, has stoked violence in the east of our country for over 30 years, compounding the war for reasons linked to the exploitation of Congo's strategic mineral resources. We call upon the Council to hold Rwanda accountable for its war crimes and crimes against humanity, particularly the forced displacement of people and their replacement by others, as well as by appointing new administrative authorities with a view to permanently occupying these territories. It's vital that international pressure be applied to Rwanda so that it immediately puts a stop to its support for the armed groups and immediately withdraws from Congolese territory. President, the Democratic Republic of Congo remains steadfastly committed to searching for peace and stability. We reiterate that we stand ready to work constructively with all regional and international actors, but it's absolutely vital the international community firmly supports our efforts to put a stop to this crisis and to put an end to the suffering of our people living in the east of our country. Thus, we reiterate our call for Rwanda to act responsibly and take immediate measures to put a stop to its support to armed groups. A consensual adoption of the resolution would be a sign of solidarity for the millions of Congolese people living under Rwandan occupation today. I thank you for your attention, President. Thank you. I'd like to thank you for your statement, and I would now like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Rwanda for his statement as a concerned country. Excellency, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to start by thanking the High Commissioner for the oral statement on the situation in the Eastern DRC, which persistently constitutes a security threat to the Great Lakes region and to Rwanda in particular. The current session is called for at a time when the situation in the Eastern DRC is evolving rapidly. The Eastern African Community Summit of 29th January and the South African Development Summit of 31st January 25 have convened a summit to discuss today and tomorrow with a view to holding a frank discussion on this crisis and in the hope of finding a lasting solution to a crisis. Therefore, we should give a chance to this important regional initiative to bear fruits before preempting their outcome and attempting to feed the ongoing discussions in the relevant UN bodies. This reminds us of the fate of the EAC regional force that made stride in imposing ceasefire and accompanying the peace process from March to September 2023, during which the M23 relinquished 8% of the territory it was previously holding. But before this process could be completed, the DRC unilaterally decided to expel the force, replacing it with the SAMI DRC with an offensive mandate in the pursuit of a military solution. Rwanda raised concerns about the substitution of the EAC force, a true peacekeeping force, with the SAMI DRC, an offensive force. SAMI DRC is now part of the Kinshasa-led military coalition, which includes the UN-sanctioned genocidal militia FDLR, Burundi forces, European mercenaries, Wazalendo with logistical and operational support by the UN. Those concerns are now proven right as we unfortunately witnessed the result of imposing a military solution to a political problem. Mr. President, these root causes, we shall repeat time and again, are on the one hand, the preservation of the FDLR, a group that committed genocide in Rwanda in 1994, fled to the DRC, where they now pose an existential threat to our security and continue spreading their genocidal ideology. On the other hand, the marginalization of Kinyarwanda-speaking Congolese community, particularly Tutsi, by the government of DRC. Everyone here in this session recalls the Congolese citizens were abominably massacred, lynched, banned, and cannibalized for looking Tutsi. Yet there was no urgent meeting or a special session on this issue. There was no condemnation of the DRC top leadership who used hate speech for electoral purposes and justified the persecution of a portion of its own citizens. Furthermore, there was no special session of this council when in April 2024, the UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, Ms. Alice Wairumu-Nderuti, warned about the risk factors for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in the Eastern DRC. Mr. President, we categorically oppose the DRC attempts to portraying Rwanda as being responsible for the instability in Eastern DRC. It is a well-known deflection tactic used to escape being accountable for the atrocities Kinshasa and its allied armed group are inflicting on their own citizens. What is clear, however, is the imminent threat the current situation poses to Rwanda. Following the fall of Goma, new evidence has come in light regarding an imminent large-scale attack against Rwanda. The Kinshasa-backed coalition has stockpiled a large number of weapons and military equipment near Rwanda's border, mostly in or around the Goma airport. These weapons include rockets, kamikaze drones, heavy artillery guns capable to shoot precisely within the Rwandan territory. The weapons were not turned at the threat of operations, at the theater of operations against the M23, rather they were pointed directly at Rwanda. I would like to recall that on January 26, 2025, retreating DRC forces fired at Rwanda, causing tragic loss of 16 Rwandan lives and injury of 161 civilians. These shelling were deliberate.
Excellency, I ask you to come to the conclusion of your statement.
They could strongly be condemned. Rwanda will not wait for the threat to materialize, and this is why our country maintain proportional, punctual, and dynamic measures to the border to prevent any spillover of this kind and respond appropriately.
Thank you for your declaration.
With regard
Je donne maintenant la parole à Madame Bintou Keita.
I now give the floor to Ms. Bintou Keita, Special Representative of the Secretary General for the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the representative of MONUSCO. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President of the Human Rights Council, Minister of Communication of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Madam Minister for Human Rights, Madam Minister for Foreign Trade, Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs, Vice Minister of National Affairs, High Commissioner, distinguished members of the Human Rights Council. I thank you for this emergency session on this extremely troubling situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I would first and foremost express my condolences to the government and the people of the Congolese people who have been victims of this conflict for 30 years and who continue to live in fear. My thoughts also go to the Blue Helmets and their families who have lost lives, and my thoughts go to those who were injured as well. I welcome those who work with commitment towards a lasting peace in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I would also like to condemn the attacks and pillaging against the UN on the 27th of September. I welcome the efforts of the government to bring perpetrators to justice and to prevent any further incidents of this nature. Mr. President, we have witnessed an unprecedented advance of the M23 and the Rwandan forces. The taking of the city of Goma on the 27th of January were preceded by violent clashes between the RDC forces, the Democratic Republic of the Congo forces and their allies, and on the other side, the Rwandan forces and their allies. There are thousands who were injured. The long-term and mid-term consequences are alarming. There is a possibility of the resurgence of cholera and mpox, and this also has an effect on the school attendance of children and the risk of sexual violence and gender-based violence due to the clashes. The presence of M23 in the North Kivu, where it occupies 4 of the 6 territories, and the taking over of several of the municipalities in the South Kivu have led to mass displacement. Moreover, we note violations and abuse of human rights, deteriorations of services, and an ever-increasingly tenuous access to basic services. The humanitarian situation has drastically declined. The economy of the province of Goma was also affected by the conflict. Agricultural and mining activities, which are the main source of income for the population, as well as for the provincial government, are paralyzed. At the same time, fighting impunity against the serious crimes committed may be impeded due to the damage caused to the judiciary institutions of Goma. It is imperative that emergency measures be taken to stabilize the region, restore peace, and allow for a lasting rebuilding in the region. Mr. President, I recall the need to pursue diplomatic negotiations between the governments of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and of Rwanda, in particular in the context of the Rwanda process. I would like to emphasize the risk of the extension of the conflict throughout the region unless deterrent, compelling measures are taken to stop an escalation of the violence. The unilateral ceasefire announced by the M23 and its partners, the Alliance for the Congo, on the 4th of February, held only for 1 day and allowed for the presumed strengthening of their positions in the North and South Kivu and the resurgence of intense combats near the city of Bukavu. These clashes in densely settled areas, including in Goma, have led to devastating consequences on the civilian population. Crime and the increase of popular justice are alarming. There has been a proliferation of weapons abandoned by soldiers, and there has been a prison break of the central prison of Goma on the 27th of January.
To force recruitment, and human rights defenders, civil society actors, and journalists have also become a major population at risk. MONUSCO continues to receive requests for individual protection from them, as well as from judicial authorities under threat and at risk of reprisal from M23 in areas under its control. Such reprisal must stop immediately. Furthermore, mis and disinformation are rampant and pose serious risk. The suspension of social networks such as X and TikTok by the Congolese authorities is a serious infringement of the right to information and must be swiftly lifted in line with the statement of the Vice Prime Minister of Interior. In a region with a sensitive history, ethnically motivated attacks remain a serious concern. United Nations Joint Human Rights Office documented a case of allegedly ethnically motivated lynching in an internally displaced person site, as well as physical and verbal violence against journalists in Goma, in Kalehe, South Kivu. Our Joint Human Rights Office has received reports of physical attacks, abduction and extortion of civilians linked to the perceived ethnicity of the victims. I thus call for unity and social cohesion and encourage the adoption of the draft law against tribalism, racism, and xenophobia. I reiterate that the humanitarian situation in Goma is catastrophic. The decomposing bodies collected from the streets of Goma prompted WHO to warn of potential epidemics. Medical personnel are facing electricity cuts and lack fuel for their generators. They work under extremely difficult conditions when ensuring the treatment of patients and the functioning of morgues. I again call on the international community to advocate for humanitarian assistance to reach Goma immediately. The rebuilding and reopening of Goma Airport, along with the cessation of GPS jamming and spoofing practices, is vital for the evacuation of the wounded and the entry of aid. Hundreds of thousands of displaced people are being forced by M23 to return to their places of origin without any guarantee or humanitarian assistance on their safe and dignified return. Among them are people with chronic diseases such as HIV or tuberculosis. We must ensure the continuation of their life-saving treatment. Mr. President, I would like to end my statement by thanking this Council and the High Commissioner for OHCHR continuous engagement on the respect of human rights in the DRC. I also acknowledge the pivotal role of Congolese women are playing in advocating for peace and human rights in the DRC, often in the face of immense personal risk. I encourage women's youth and women's groups to coordinate their efforts and stand in solidarity. To support them and all peace actors in the DRC, I look forward to this session taking concrete steps to halt the long-lasting suffering of the Congolese population and pave the way for inclusive and sustainable development. Thank you for your attention.
Je vous remercie pour votre déclaration.
I thank you for your statement and for your efforts in making the journey to come here to be with us today. We will now begin with the speakers list. Allow me to remind you that the speaking time is limited to 2 minutes and 30 seconds for members of the Council and 1 minute and 30 seconds for observer states and other observers. I would ask each speaker to comply with the speaking time. The speakers list will be closed in 15 minutes. We begin by the speakers for the member states of the Council. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sweden on behalf of a group of countries.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries. And let me start by thanking the High Commissioner and the Special Representative for their clear and compelling briefings. Mr. President, we are deeply concerned about the escalating violence in Eastern DRC. We urge the M23 to stop its advance and withdraw immediately. We reiterate that Rwanda must cease its support for the M23 and withdraw its armed forces. We strongly condemn Rwanda's military presence in the DRC as a clear violation of international law the UN Charter, and the territorial integrity of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we continue to urge the DRC to cease its cooperation with the FDLR. We are alarmed by reports of widespread violations and abuses of human rights and international humanitarian law by multiple actors, including sexual and gender-based violence, the recruitment and use of child soldiers, and extrajudicial executions. The offensive has deepened the already disastrous humanitarian crisis in Eastern DRC. The risk of large numbers of IDPs being caught between the conflicting parties is deeply worrying. All sides must prioritize protection of civilians, ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian access, and fully respect their obligations under international law, including human rights law and international humanitarian law. Mr. President, we call for all perpetrators of atrocity crimes to be held accountable. Impunity must not be allowed. We commend the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC's renewed investigative efforts in the DRC, with a priority focus given to any alleged Rome Statute crimes occurring in Eastern DRC since January 2022. We fully support the work of the High Commissioner, as well as the team of international experts on the DRC, whose mandate was renewed at the 57th regular session of the Human Rights Council. In conclusion, Mr. President, we call for a quick resumption of political dialogue and negotiations in the Rwanda process, and also reiterate our support to the Nairobi process. We support the need to investigate and document all human rights abuses and violations in Eastern Congo and identify those responsible. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, High Commissioner, Albania, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Moldova, and Ukraine align themselves with the statement. For decades, the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo has witnessed instability, as well as human rights violations and abuses. The root causes and drivers are complex, multi-layered, and interlinked. Over the past few weeks, the situation has escalated and led to thousands of deaths and wounded and forced displacement of hundreds of thousands of Congolese civilians. Reports of grave violations and abuses of human rights, including summary executions, demand our immediate attention. In particular, the European Union is abhorred by reports of a dramatic increase in cases of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. Furthermore, the recently deadly attacks on peacekeepers, whose aim is to protect the civilian population, are utterly intolerable and may constitute grave violations of international law. The European Union condemns in the strongest terms the offensive of the M23 supported by the Rwandan armed forces in Eastern DRC that led to the occupations of large parts of Congolese territory in North and South Kivu, including the city of Goma. The EU urges the M23 to stop its advance and withdraw immediately. The EU also strongly condemns Rwanda's military presence in the DRC as a clear violation of international law, the UN Charter, and the territorial integrity of the DRC. We call on the Rwandan government to respect the territorial integrity of the DRC by immediately withdrawing all troops from the territory of the DRC and end all forms of support for M23 and other non-state armed groups. The EU also continues to urge the DRC to cease cooperation with the FDLR and other armed groups and take a decisive stance against hate speech. We call upon all parties to re-engage in negotiations and be open for inclusive talks with all. We also call upon all parties to respect international law and to honor their commitments made under the Rwanda and Nairobi process. Mr. President, this Council cannot stand idle when international human rights law is being disregarded once again in Eastern DRC. All accusations of violations and abuses need to be thoroughly investigated, victims recognized and supported, and all perpetrators need to be held accountable for all their crimes. We therefore support the resolution put forward by the DRC requesting the establishment of an independent fact-finding mission to investigate and document all violations and abuses of human rights in Eastern DRC and identify all those responsible.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Morocco. Thank you, President High Commissioner. My delegation would like to extend a warm welcome to the delegation of the friendly and brotherly country of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And we share with that country the feeling of solidarity, compassion, and support given the alarming humanitarian situation in the country, given the humanitarian crisis and the risk for the territorial integrity. It is essential to address these issues, and this means that through this session we're holding today, we need to address the underlying issues. So we welcome the resolution of the Security Council on the DRC, as well as the praiseworthy role of the Blue Helmets in this country, of which the Moroccan contingent is a key component, working towards ensuring the stability of this brotherly people. The role of the Blue Helmets remains essential, despite the crisis situation which is developing, as we can see today. My delegation would also like to highlight the role of the High Commissioner and his teams on the ground in attempting to analyze the massive violations that are taking place and establish major evidence for the Council. This extraordinary session of the Human Rights Council is being held, let us recall this, at the request of the concerned country, and is the most appropriate framework to address the human rights violations established by the Human Rights Council in the east of the country, which have already led to all forms of violence against civilians, including women and children. Given the crisis situation regarding human rights in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as well as the consequence of the conflict taking place, the effectiveness of any action of the Council will be crucial to move forward and face this crisis and allow for all those involved to take action. My government has been firm in this position. As to the destabilizing role of the armed groups, which must be condemned in the strongest terms, we express our will to achieve a lasting peace in the DRC. We hope that this extraordinary session can help us in that, with the diplomatic efforts underway, which were referred to this morning as well. We hope that we will be able to achieve this aim following a 30-year crisis, which is plaguing the international community and which makes it imperative for it to act, as well as this Council. Thank you.
To the distinguished representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. We stand at the critical juncture in the east of our continent. The ongoing crisis in DRC poses an existential threat to the peace and security of an already fragile region, demanding our immediate attention. The humanitarian situation in the DRC has reached catastrophic proportions, creating a spillover effect within the region. Reports of widespread human rights abuses, including gender-based violence and severe protectionist incidents, are deeply alarming. We call for the immediate restoration of essential services, including internet services, to alleviate the sufferings of the Goma's population. As the current chair of EAC and a long-standing advocate for peace in the region, Kenya is deeply invested in fostering dialogue and cooperation amongst our members. Guided by the mantra, African Solutions for African Challenges, we welcome the ongoing peace efforts, including the Nairobi and the Rwanda processes. The upcoming joint EAC and SADC summit presents a critical opportunity for dialogue, and we believe any action taken by this Council should complement these efforts. It is imperative that our deliberations and outcomes today do not inadvertently undermine the forthcoming summit, but rather contribute towards the broader regional framework for peace and stability in the DRC. To this end, we urge all stakeholders to reject divisive rhetorics and join call for immediate cessation of hostilities and return to a negotiating table. We remain committed to working with all parties to achieve a lasting, peaceful resolution that respects sovereignty and territorial integrity of DRC, while addressing the legitimate security concern of all states in the region. The situation in Eastern DRC is not merely a localized conflict, but a manifestation of historic challenges intertwined with the legacy of colonialism, wanton and illicit resource extraction, political fragmentation, and intercommunal divisions, which must be addressed. These deep-rooted injustices have undermined governance, fueled conflicts, and human suffering. We urge this Council to take concrete steps in addressing human rights situations in DRC as a testament of our collective resolve as a national community to shape a just and peaceful world. I thank you.
Thank you. Je donne la parole au distingué.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
President,
President, the deterioration of the situation has made this special session of the Council essential, where the heads of state are meeting. This Council must address the challenges that is covered by its mandate. The situation in North Kivu is alarming. For many years, France has been mobilized and has called for the mobilization of the international community to face this. The offensive launched by the M23 with the support of Rwanda has had devastating effects for a vulnerable situation, and the reminder of the High Commissioner and the Secretary General and their reports have shed clear light on the cruel situation. The M23 must immediately withdraw from the territories of which it has taken control. We call for dialogue and to support the Rwanda and Nairobi processes. We call on commitments to be upheld, withdrawal from the Congolese territory, and an addressing of the violation of human rights and international humanitarian by the FDLR and other armed forces. We must return to the negotiating table, ensure the protection of civilians, and uphold human rights. All efforts must be taken to put an end to the humanitarian disaster. We express our support to the United Nations and the international community as a whole in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Safe conditions must be provided for humanitarian actors to provide assistance in safety to civilians. Violence against civilians must stop. Collective rapes of women in Goma at the prison on the 27th of January, if confirmed, may constitute a war crime, just as the MONUSCO must ensure the protection of the civilians. Crimes of that nature cannot remain unpunished. France thanks the team of experts for its work, and we call for an adoption by consensus of a resolution to strengthen its mandate and the urgent establishment of a fact-finding mission on the serious violations against human rights and international humanitarian law in North Kivu and the remainder of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We thank the Minister of Communication of the DRC, and we reiterate our call for solidarity with the Congolese people and the upholding of the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of her country. Thank you.
Distinguished representative of North Macedonia.
Mr. President, High Commissioner, North Macedonia expresses deep concern over the dire and deteriorating human rights situation in the eastern part of the DRC, particularly in North and South Kivu. The recent escalation of hostilities has resulted in severe human rights violations, including attacks on civilians, widespread conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence, and forced displacement. We strongly condemn all actions of the armed groups responsible for these atrocities and any parties complicit in perpetuating this violence. The deliberate targeting of vulnerable groups, women, children, and internally displaced persons flagrantly violates international human rights and humanitarian law. The humanitarian impact of this crisis is grave and demands urgent actions. Therefore, we urge all parties to immediately cease hostilities, protect civilians, and uphold human rights obligations. Attacks on peacekeeping personnel and diplomatic community are inexcusable. We call for thorough investigations to ensure accountability for committed human rights abuses. Furthermore, the international community must strengthen its support for peacekeeping operations and humanitarian assistance. A sustainable solution demands coordinated efforts, including dialogue, reconciliation, and development initiatives that foster stability and social cohesion. North Macedonia stands in solidarity with the Congolese people and reaffirms its unwavering commitment to human rights, peace, and security in the region. We fully support the urgent establishment of an independent fact-finding mission to investigate serious human rights violations and breaches of international humanitarian law committed in North and South Kivu in the eastern part of the DRC. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Spain.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. Spain endorses the European Union's statement. We welcome the holding of this special session in view of the serious situation. My country vehemently condemns the recent offensive in eastern DRC by the M23 rebel group supported by Rwanda. This is a flagrant violation of international law. This has caused a humanitarian crisis and increased the risk of a large-scale regional war. Spain denounces serious human rights violations occurring in the context of this escalating violence, particularly summary execution, forced conscription of children, sexual and gender-based violence and forced displacement of hundreds of thousands, as has been set out by the High Commissioner and the Special Representative. We urge all those involved in the conflict to respect human rights, international humanitarian, and ensure that civilians have full access to humanitarian aid and that the Luanda and Nairobi processes be resumed. We urge Rwanda to respect the DRC's sovereignty and territorial integrity and halt any support to the M23 and withdraw from the DRC's territory. Spain supports the DRC's draft resolution calling for the establishment of an independent mission to document and investigate serious human rights violations and those of international humanitarian law committed in South and North Kivu since the start of 2022. This decision will strengthen already existing cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner. As members of the Council are responsible, take the measures to prevent any further deterioration of the situation. We also think that the call from the International Criminal Court is particularly important today, especially. Accountability is a key to ensuring justice and reparation for the population, which is just exhausted after decades of suffering. The Council is sending a clear message today of its belief in a rules-based international order grounded in respect for human rights. I thank you.
Thank you, Excellencies, colleagues. The list of speakers is now closed, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, Ghana conveys its appreciation to the Presidency for swiftly convening the special session of the Council. We also thank the High Commissioner and other briefers for the informative briefing on the prevailing human rights, security, and humanitarian situation in Eastern DRC. My delegation is gravely concerned about the unfolding crisis and the widespread violence, mostly affecting civilians in the region of North and South Kivu. We regret very much the indiscriminate military attacks and the ongoing violation of the international humanitarian law and human rights law. We are further saddened by the loss of lives of UN peacekeepers who have had to pay the ultimate sacrifice and express our condolences to their families and governments. We strongly support the passionate calls for the end of all forms of violence against civilian population made by the Secretary General of the United Nations, the African Union Peace and Security Council, and recently by the Southern African Development Community. We further underline the need for accountability for all atrocities committed against civilians. Mr. President, the recurring instability in Goma is likely to plunge the DRC and the entire region into dire political, economic, social, and human rights and humanitarian crisis. The sheer number of internally displaced persons will not only pose significant security and humanitarian risk, but will draw the region back on the socio-economic gains made over the years. Ghana appeals to the humanitarian community to rally immediate support for the protection of the population, particularly the vulnerable section of the population, notably women and children. Ghana further calls for the immediate halt to the military hostilities and de-escalation of the mounting tensions. We address our call to all armed groups to lay down their weapons and withdraw from the sovereign territory of DRC. All actors, both state and non-state, have a duty to respect the Charter of the United Nations and its principles, which serves as the bedrock of the international system, including the obligation to settle disputes through peaceful means. In this context, we urge all the armed actors participating in the ongoing conflict to submit to dialogue, which remain crucial to restoring peace, stability to Eastern DRC. In conclusion, I wish to reiterate Ghana's respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC.
Thank you.
And to contribute meaningfully to the ongoing...
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Mr. President, Mr. High Commissioner, Germany aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. Germany firmly condemns the Rwanda-backed M23 offensive. The actions by the M23 and the Rwandan Defense Forces constitute a blatant violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and they have grave humanitarian consequences. The people of Eastern DRC, a region already facing severe poverty and instability and marked by decades of conflict, now face a spiraling humanitarian and human rights crisis. There have been appalling reports of severe sexual and gender-based violence by both sides, including mass rapes, the use of child soldiers, and summary killings. Information received from Goma's hospitals paint a horrific picture of utter disregard of human rights, humanitarian law, and indeed humanity. We therefore thank the High Commissioner for his timely briefing today. We echo his call for an end to the violence and for all parties to uphold their obligations under international human rights law and international humanitarian law. This conflict and the severe sufferings of civilians have lasted far too long. They must end, not spread further. We urge all parties to fully commit to a peaceful and negotiated resolution of the conflict, an inclusive political process under African leadership, as already laid out in the Luanda and Nairobi processes. It is the only way forward. Rwanda must withdraw its troops and support for M23. The DRC also needs to take Rwandan security concerns seriously, counter hate speech, and neutralize anti-Rwandan militia. The affected civilians, women and children in particular, rely on the vital support of peacekeepers and humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian organizations need full, safe and unhindered humanitarian access to all people in need, so that they can continue their life-saving efforts. We therefore call upon all actors to grant this access immediately. We welcome that the initiative has been brought forward by the concerned country, the DRC itself. Germany is ready to support the proposed establishment of an independent fact-finding mission to ensure that violations are documented and all perpetrators are held accountable. Thank you.
Thank you. Je donne la parole.
I call on the distinguished representative of Switzerland. Thank you, President. Switzerland supports the convening of this special session, and we express our consternation at the worsening security, humanitarian and human rights situation in Eastern DRC. We denounce the attack on Goma by the M23 with Rwanda's support and its continuing advance through South Kivu. Switzerland calls for the DRC sovereignty and territorial integrity to be respected. Violence has reached an alarming level, causing unspeakable suffering for civilians. All human rights violations of international humanitarian law, particularly attacks on civilians and civilian property, as well as conflict-related and gender-based sexual violence, are unacceptable and cannot go unpunished. Goma is facing a humanitarian emergency. Shops, warehouses have been looted by different parties to conflict, making it harder and harder to get humanitarian aid. We call for humanitarian access to be restored swiftly, including the reopening of Goma Airport for humanitarian flights. All parties to conflict must agree a ceasefire and that humanitarian aid be provided to the vulnerable, measures be put in place to ensure safety of displaced persons, their access to basic services pursuant to international law. Switzerland calls on all parties to strictly respect international humanitarian law, protect civilians in particular, and immediately de-escalate. We call on Rwanda to stop its support for M23 and withdraw its troops from Congolese territory. Furthermore, the DRC must roll out its plan to neutralize the Democratic Forces of Liberation of Rwanda, and we also condemn the brazen atrocities committed by the ADF. RDF. Lastly, Switzerland supports mediation efforts made by the regional community, particularly the Rwanda process. We urge the DRC and Rwanda to resume negotiations and encourage initiatives to combat impunity. Justice and accountability for international humanitarian law violations, those of human rights, must be made a priority. I thank you. Thank you, and I'll call on the distinguished representative of Albania. Thank you, President.
Align itself with the EU statement. The situation in Democratic Republic of Congo is of serious concern. We are particularly alarmed by the recent surge in violence in the eastern region of the country, where clashes between government forces and M23 armed group has resulted in significant loss of lives, displacements of civilian, and widespread suffering. Albania strongly condemns persistent human rights violations and abuses, including sexual violence, summary execution, and forced disappearance, and targeted attack on human rights defenders, journalists, and other civil society actors. We express our profound alarm about the increasing danger to women and girls for violence, including rape, and the recruitment of children by armed groups. We urge M23 to stop its advance and issue the Secretary General appealed to Rwanda to cease support of M23 and withdraw from DRC territory. Albania called for robust accountability measure to be implemented. We will support the establishment of an independent fact-finding mission to investigate human rights violation and international human rights violations in North and South Kivu province. It's imperative that those responsible for human rights violation and atrocities are brought to justice. We commend the efforts of United Nations and other humanitarian organizations working tirelessly on the ground to deliver aid and to protect vulnerable population. Albania reaffirmed its support for MONUSCO and condemned any attack against UN mandate force. We believe that there is no military solution to the crisis and emphasize the need for an inclusive political dialogue between DRC, Rwanda, and other regional and international actors to address the root causes of the conflict. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cyprus.
Mr. President, High Commissioner, Cyprus aligns itself with the statement of the EU. We add our voice to express our deep concern about the continued and intensifying escalation of the crisis in eastern DRC. We condemn the reported widespread violations of human rights, including summary executions, sexual and gender-based violence, the recruitment of child soldiers, but also the increasing number of internally displaced persons. At the same time, we're extremely worried by the interruption in humanitarian assistance, as well as shortages of food, water, and medical supplies, all of which have had a negative impact on civilians. All sides have an obligation to prioritize the protection of civilians and their safe and unhindered access to humanitarian aid. The ongoing instability risks unleashing the possibility of greater regional war, evoking the catastrophic conflicts of the 1990s. Moreover, it undermines African-led efforts to reach a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The continued advances of the M23, backed by Rwanda, constitutes a violation of the agreed ceasefire and a violation of international law. We reaffirm our commitment to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of the DRC and all states in the region. We express our unwavering support for MONUSCO and condemn attacks against UN-mandated forces. We support the resumption of negotiations within the Luanda process and urge all sides to reach a sustainable, peaceful, and political solution to the crisis. I thank you.
Thank you. Je donne la parole à la...
I call on the distinguished representative of Belgium. President, Belgium welcomes the initiative taken by the DRC in calling for a special session of the Council in view of the escalating conflict in eastern DRC. This Council cannot remain silent because its role is to prevent and independently report on human rights violations. This is particularly the case when it's the concerned country of the violations which calls for the sanction. Belgium supports thus the Congolese authorities' request for an independent fact-finding mission on incidents that have occurred since January 2022 in the east of the country. Full light must immediately be shed on these violations and their perpetrators held accountable. On a number of occasions, Belgium has raised its concern and denounced the number of human rights violations in the DRC, particularly those against women and children. Once more, my country is alarmed by reports of massacres, conflict-related sexual violence, summary executions, attacks on civilian infrastructure, and a disastrous humanitarian situation in which the number of displaced people and redisplaced people has increased enormously. This compounds a long list of violations and attacks throughout the country. Belgium calls on all parties to conflict to immediately halt the violations of international humanitarian law and human rights, and to commit once again to peace negotiations. We condemn the M23 offensive supported by Rwanda, and we call upon the Rwandan government to withdraw all its troops from the DRC and to halt any form of support to the M23. In addition to establishing the independent fact-finding mission, Belgium underscores the importance of ensuring that this mission be properly funded and staffed immediately. We also call upon the Council's international team of experts to cooperate fully with the Commission of Inquiry. I round off by recalling the importance of fighting impunity, both for victims and the stability of the country and the Great Lakes region. We call upon all parties to make a constructive and serious commitment to these efforts. I thank you. I now call upon the distinguished representative of Costa Rica. Thank you very much, President. Costa Rica thanks the Democratic Republic of the Congo because against a backdrop of attacks on multilateralism and the human rights situation, this country, which is mired in a terrible situation in its own territory, is encouraging us to use the mechanisms that the international community has created to act effectively, as the Council has done in the past. The east of the DRC is going through an incredibly serious humanitarian and human rights crisis, which is driven by the violence of the M23 rebels and its conflict with government forces and other armed parties. This situation has led to mass displacement, killings, sexual and gender-based violence on a systematic level, and destruction of basic infrastructure, including hospitals and houses. Recent reports confirm atrocities such as 163 women being burned alive in Goma and deliberate attacks against women, human rights defenders, and maternity hospitals. This is unprecedented and unacceptable. This conflict is grounded in complex geopolitics with a view to controlling the vast mineral resources in the region. For decades, we've been raising alarm about the environment, water, and natural resources being the cause of many modern conflicts. That's why it's vital to work towards the respect, promotion, and protection of the human right to a free, healthy, and sustainable environment, as well as ensuring that we have a sustainable environment so that we can promote economic, social, and cultural rights, because they're the tools for building peaceful societies. President Costa Rica calls for a halt to all hostilities and that all parties to conflict respect human rights, international humanitarian law. It's vital that victims are supported and have access to humanitarian aid, and the perpetrators of war crimes and human rights violations be held accountable. And those who benefit from very profitable contracts with Rwanda and the DRC in the mineral industry must be held accountable for putting their economic interests above human dignity. We cannot allow this to... The speaker is interrupted. I call on the distinguished representative of Burundi. President, Burundi welcomes the convening of this special session on the human rights situation in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and is pleased to be among the 27 member states who have taken the initiative to support this session. In fact, Goma is the scene of unprecedented humanitarian disaster. Thousands have lost their lives, including women and children. and around 1 million people have been displaced and made refugees. This is a tragic consequence of the M23 incursion with the military and logistic support of Rwanda. This violates the basic principles of international relations established in the UN Charter. We'd like to take this opportunity to reiterate the Burundian government's solidarity with the Congolese people and express our condolences to bereaved families. We'd also like to pay tribute to UN peacekeepers who've made the ultimate sacrifice for the purposes of peace. So our compassion is extended to delegations of Uruguay, Malawi, and South Africa. For over 30 years, the Democratic Republic of Congo has been suffering, and we cannot turn a blind eye to this. This is because there are dark foreign interests which underlie the geopolitical situation and the looting and illicit exploitation of natural resources. For over 10 years, Burundi has been calling on the Council to pay attention to the situation of Rwanda supporting armed terrorist groups which are on the rampage killing civilians. We have seen this quite clearly. There's the risk of this igniting the Great Lakes region. Time has come to establish the facts, to hold those responsible for those actions and adopt a strong resolution which denounces a serious and persistent human rights violation in North and South Kivu, and which calls on the Rwandan forces and M23 to withdraw from occupied areas. Territorial integrity and sovereignty of the DRC must be restored and respected. Burundi firmly believes in the peaceful coexistence between nations, and we would underscore the efforts made by the African Union as well as other regional mechanisms and sub-regional mechanisms in the Luanda and Nairobi processes. I thank you. I call on the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the President for convening this special session. Japan expresses its deep concern about the deteriorating human rights and humanitarian situation in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, particularly around Goma in North Kivu province and Minova in South Kivu province. A recent offensive in the region has resulted in the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people and numerous casualties among the civilian population, and has severely affected vulnerable people, including women and children. Japan extends its deepest condolences to the victims and conveys its heartfelt sympathy to all who are injured. Those lost and injured include personnel of the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, MONUSCO, and the Southern African Development Community Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Japan renews its call on M23 to immediately cease its attacks and withdraw. In this regard, we urge all parties to respect the ceasefire agreement and to respect MONUSCO's mission to protect civilians and ensure humanitarian access to those in need. We also call on all parties to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian rights and humanitarian law, including protection of the civilians and diplomatic missions. Japan believes that the diplomatic and political solution by the DRC, Rwanda, and other countries in the region, as well as the securing of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC based on respect for the rule of law and humanitarian dignity, are important in order to achieve sustainable peace in the Eastern DRC. Japan supports regional peace mediation efforts, including the Rwanda process and the Nairobi process, and calls for the immediate resumption of negotiations for peace. Japan will support the proposed resolution and continue to work with the international community and support regional peace mediation efforts aiming to protect civilians and uphold their human rights. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Brazil is following with great concern the deterioration of human rights and humanitarian situation in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo. We call on all parties to recommit to the ceasefire agreement and to engage in ongoing mediation efforts. as well as to respect international human rights and humanitarian law. Moreover, Brazil urges all actors to allow unimpeded humanitarian aid to the population affected. Brazil emphasizes that the protection of civilians is a fundamental obligation under international law. We are particularly concerned about acts of violence targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, including reports of sexual and gender-based violence. Threats against human rights defenders, journalists, and civil society organizations must also be condemned, along with the use of hate speech. We reiterate that all parties to the conflict are obliged to ensure the safety and the protection of UN personnel and facilities. Brazil supports the role of MONUSCO and SAMI-DRC to regional stability and peace. Brazil also supports the work of the HRC's team of international experts to improve the human rights situation in the whole Congo and as an important means to bring peace and security to the region. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of Korea is gravely concerned about the rapidly deteriorating situation in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. Innocent civilians, including women and children, are enduring extreme suffering due to widespread violence, displacement, and deprivation of essential services such as food, water, and healthcare. We condemn persistent violations of international human rights and international humanitarian laws, including sexual and gender-based violence, summary executions, and forced recruitment of child soldiers. Reports of explosive weapons used in populated areas and attacks on internally displaced person sites are particularly alarming. In this regard, we urge all parties to end violence and uphold their obligations under international law. In particular, we call on M23 to immediately cease its territorial expansion and reverse its military offensive without delay. Even at this very important very moment, civilians continue to flee in search of refuge with no safe alternatives. The ongoing hostilities must stop to prevent further human suffering. It is crucial that the Human Rights Council provides necessary support for thorough investigations into grave human rights violations and abuses with a view to bringing the perpetrators to justice and ensuring the comprehensive accountability. Furthermore, both the DRC and Rwanda must heed the international community's call for a return to meaningful negotiations and fully honor their obligations under the Rwanda process. A sustained and inclusive dialogue is crucial to achieving a long-term and peaceful resolution to the crisis. As a committed member of the Human Rights Council, the Republic of Korea will continue to work with the international community to ensure that human rights remain at the center of our collective response to this crisis. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. President, China is following closely the security situation in the eastern part of DRC. We are alarmed and shocked by the recent sharp escalation of tensions. We strongly condemn the attacks on civilians and UN peacekeepers, and are worried about the human rights and humanitarian crisis resulting from this situation. China reaffirms its unwavering support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, including that of DRC. And China supports the efforts of the governments concerned to safeguard national security. We believe diplomatic negotiations are the only way to resolve the questions in the eastern part of DRC. We call on all parties to conflict to fully respect international law, to protect fundamental human rights, to achieve immediate ceasefire, return to diplomatic dialogue, and resolve their concerns through dialogue and negotiation. China advocates African solutions to African problems and calls on all parties to support the mediation efforts of relevant regional organizations and African countries. Mr. President, there is a clear division of labor among the various organs of the UN, and only each plays its proper role can synergy be achieved. At a time when the Security Council has already intervened but has not yet made a decision, we believe this Council should act prudently. This special session, at the request of the DRC, during this session, we believe any discussion and action should reflect international solidarity and to create favorable conditions to prevent further deterioration, to promote de-escalation and political solution. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ethiopia maintains sisterly relations with the DRC and countries of the region and is concerned by current developments and underscores the urgent need to address the humanitarian crisis and restore peace in the DRC. Ethiopia reiterates the call by the Secretary General of the UN, the chairperson of the AU Commission, for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the protection of civilians. Ethiopia also supports the call by the African Union Peace and Security Council for the strict adherence to international humanitarian law and human rights law. We emphasize the need to protect civilians, internally displaced persons, medical sites, and peacekeepers. Ethiopia reaffirms the fundamental importance of respecting the principles of non-interference in the internal affairs of sovereign nations and fostering friendly relations among states. These principles are critical to build trust and lay the foundation for peace in the Great Lakes region. It is essential that neighboring countries and regional economic communities adopt a coherent and constructive approach in supporting the DRC's pursuit of peace and security. In accordance with the Addis Ababa Framework Agreement, the African Union should discharge its coordination role in supporting the Rwanda and other relevant regional processes and must continue to exercise political leadership in addressing the legitimate security concerns of neighboring countries. Ethiopia emphasizes the importance of international support for the DRC in consolidating state authority, particularly in the eastern provinces where the lack of effective governance and security exacerbates the humanitarian crisis. Humanitarian and life-saving assistance must be scaled up in support of populations most affected by the conflict, particularly women and children. Ethiopia also emphasizes that safety of peacekeepers is of paramount importance. Ethiopia's commitment to peacekeeping in the Great Lakes region is long-standing. In the 1960s, Ethiopian peacekeepers were at the forefront of the UN operations in Congo, where we sustained some of the largest peacekeeping casualties in the history of the mission. We call on all armed actors to refrain from the heinous conduct of targeting peacekeepers. In conclusion, Ethiopia remains firm in its belief that a sustainable resolution to the ongoing crisis can only be achieved through inclusive dialogue, strengthened by regional cooperation and the full engagement of the international community. Ethiopia stands ready to continue its constructive role in supporting the DRC and regional peace processes. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico.
Gracias. Thank you, President. Mexico expresses its consternation at the escalating violence in eastern DRC. This had a dire effect on the human rights situation. Reports of a dreadful situation are particularly worrying. People have died, been displaced, there's a lack of basic services, and civil infrastructure has been destroyed, amongst other things. We particularly deplore the reported conflict-related sexual violence, which disproportionately affects women and children. We stand in solidarity with the victims and survivors of acts of violence. In view of the very serious situation, Mexico supported the DRC's request to convene a special session of the Human Rights Council so that we can hold a dialogue and take action. This reflects the relevance of this multilateral forum, and that's why Mexico is taking the floor here in this forum to urgently call for a dialogue between the parties and a halt to hostilities, as well as full respect for international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We also make an appeal for the Rwanda and Nairobi processes to be resumed, and we reiterate our firm support for MONUSCO. President, Mexico also supports the High Commissioner for Human Rights calls for the human rights crisis in the eastern DRC to be addressed. And that's why we welcome the fact that it was the DRC itself, as the concerned country, that requested this special session and has submitted a draft resolution to establish an independent fact-finding mission which must investigate alleged human rights abuses and violations, and those of international humanitarian law, committed by all parties to conflict. And considering the principle of African solutions to African problems, Mexico supports the idea that the decision taken by the Council complements sub-regional efforts to bring peace to the area, led by the East Africa Community and SADC. And we pray that the upcoming summit in Tanzania will help us work towards peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement. And we thank the Democratic Republic of Congo for taking the initiative for the special session. We consider this special session and the wide support it received to be a vote of confidence in this Council and its role in upholding international human rights law, wherever and whenever. Like many others, we are concerned about the rapidly deteriorating situation in the DRC. Concretely, the Kingdom of the Netherlands calls upon the Rwandan government to immediately withdraw all of its troops from the territory of the DRC and end all forms of support for M23. At the same time, we feel the need to urge the DRC to stop hate speech and cease cooperation with the FDLR and other armed groups. Mr. President, Mr. High Commissioner, you would agree that the abuses and violations committed by any party to the conflict currently ongoing in the east of DRC need to be documented and the evidence collected preserved so that perpetrators on both sides can be held accountable for their crimes. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. South Africa stands in solidarity with the people of the DRC following the destruction wreaked on their lives of the innocent as a result of the recent M23 offensive in the eastern part of the country. We wish to reaffirm our unwavering commitment to continue supporting the DRC to secure the lasting peace and prosperity that its people and those of the Great Lakes have yearned for and rightly deserve. It is for this reason that South Africa supported the request by the DRC to hold a special session, given the gravity of the human rights situation in the country as reflected by the horrific violations and abuses of international human rights and humanitarian law that have been perpetrated in this regard. These include the summary executions and forced disappearances, recruitment of children, forced labor and conscription, together with indiscriminate attacks against already vulnerable populations. Of particular concern are the reports of the high levels of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence targeting women and girls, which, as the High Commissioner has stated, has been an appalling feature of the armed conflict in the eastern part of the country. Beyond the dire human rights situation, South Africa is also deeply concerned about the exacerbation of the humanitarian crisis. Accordingly, given the unfolding humanitarian tragedy, and in line with the statement of the UNSC meeting of 26 January 2025, South Africa calls on the M23, the Rwandan Defense Forces, and other unauthorized armed groups to immediately cease their armed activities and guarantee rapid, unhindered, and safe access to humanitarian aid without any further delay. We welcome regional efforts, including the extraordinary summit of SADC, held on 31 January 2025 in Harare, the joint SADC-EAC summit currently taking place in Dar es Salaam. We similarly reiterate that there can be no military solution to the current conflict and call on parties concerned to immediately go back to the Rwanda process and resume the Nairobi processes. Given the sheer scale of this human suffering, we fully support the resolution that is currently under consideration. And indeed, we believe that the establishment of the fact-finding mission is the right way to go. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, my delegation welcomes the wisdom of the Council in convening this special session at the request of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We are deeply concerned by the reemergence of the conflict in the east of the DRC, giving rise to systematic violence, especially attacks against civilians, women and children, as well as massive human rights and international humanitarian law violations. The extreme situation in which millions of Congolese find themselves is alarming. We require access for humanitarian access to the vulnerable and recall to all parties their responsibilities under IHL. Persons must be protected and humanitarian assistance must be provided in an unimpeded fashion. We call for restraint and de-escalation with a view to resuming dialogue, with a view to a political solution to put an end to the plight of the Congolese, to uphold the respect of the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of the DRC, and the restoration of a lasting peace in the region. In this spirit, we align ourselves with the conclusions of the Community of Eastern Africa and the Southern African Community. We are particularly pleased at the holding in Dar es Salaam at this very moment of a joint summit between SADC and the Eastern African Community. We fully support the regional processes underway and call on all parties to uphold their commitments in the face of heavy adversity. We are committed in Kenya and Angola, and the support is provided. We are prepared to extend our mediation efforts to the restoration of peace and stability in the DRC and the region of the Great Lakes as a general. Thank you.
English representative of the Gambia.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Gambia extends its deepest condolences to the government and people of the Democratic Republic of Congo for the tragic loss of lives in recent events that have engulfed the eastern part of the country. We stand in solidarity with all affected families and communities during this period. As a firm advocate of accountability for gross human rights abuses whenever they occur, the Gambia underscores the importance of accountability mechanisms as a critical pillar of ending impunity. The Human Rights Council has a crucial role to play to restore respect for human rights for the people of DRC and ensure accountability for perpetrators of human rights violations. However, the crisis in DRC requires a comprehensive and inclusive approach to ensure lasting peace and security. In this regard, the upcoming AU Peace and Security Council meeting at the heads of states level on the 14th of February 2025 will provide an opportunity to chart a path forward for sustainable peace in the region. Accordingly, the Gambia stresses the need for coordinated efforts between the mechanisms established by the Human Rights Council and the regional peace efforts in the interest of the long-suffering victims of the crisis. Mr. President, the Gambia further calls on all parties to uphold the principles of international humanitarian law and human rights to ensure the protection of civilians and safeguard their fundamental rights and freedoms. The Gambia remains committed to supporting all efforts aimed at ending impunity for human rights violations and achieving lasting peace in the DRC and in the Great Lakes region. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kyrgyzstan.
Mr. President, Kyrgyzstan is deeply concerned with the ongoing humanitarian catastrophe in the east of Democratic Republic of Congo. And we fully support the decision on the fact-finding mission. We commend the continued efforts of the African Union and recall the communique of January 28th, adopted by the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, that calls all parties to seek peaceful diplomatic solutions to end hostilities. We reaffirm our unwavering commitment to the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity as enshrined in the UN Charter. As a candidate for the UN Security Council, we are convinced that the adherence to this principle helped us to keep us safe so far from the World War III. Kyrgyzstan also firmly believes that the state is the ultimate guarantor of the human rights. Only viable state of the Democratic Republic of Congo might ensure human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bulgaria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Bulgaria aligns with the EU statement. Let me highlight that Bulgaria is deeply concerned over the human rights situation in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which continues to deteriorate as hostilities between the two sides of the conflict are gravely escalating. We strongly condemn the persistent violations and abuses of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, including the indiscriminate use of explosive weapons in densely populated areas, summary executions, sexual violence, forced conscription of children into armed forces, forced child labor, and the forced displacement of populations, as evidenced by the High Commissioners and other reports we heard earlier this morning. We demand swift measures to ensure enhanced protection of civilians, especially those in vulnerable situations, women, children, persons with disabilities, and the elderly. Bulgaria calls for an immediate cessation of violence and for all parties to the conflict to fulfill their obligations under international human rights and international humanitarian law. We firmly condemn the attacks on UN humanitarian personnel. We underscore the necessity of ensuring immediate and unimpeded access to humanitarian and medical aid of the civilian population. Bulgaria declares its support for the establishment of the independent fact-finding commission of the serious violations and abuses of human rights and serious violations of international humanitarian law committed in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and we hope that the Commission will be operational soon. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Je donne la parole à la distinguée.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malawi.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening this session. In Malawi, also thanks the High Commissioner for his statement. We expressed our grave concern on the ongoing situation in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, which has resulted in loss of lives, injuries, displacement of mostly women and children, and a fragile security and humanitarian situation. As a contributing country to the Southern African Development Community Mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Malawi welcomes the efforts being made by relevant regional and international organizations in working towards sustained peace in the eastern part of the DRC and the entire region. We welcome the political and diplomatic steps taken by the Peace and Security Council of the African Union and the Southern African Development Community as reflected in their respective communique of 28th and 31st January 2025. The special session of this council, therefore, is adding a very important layer of ongoing efforts in addressing the situation in the eastern part of the DRC. We urge all parties to engage in coordinated efforts of dialogue, such as the Rwanda and Nairobi processes for the restoration of peace and security in Eastern DRC. We condemn the violence and reaffirm our solidarity with the people of the DRC in their pursuit of safeguarding their independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, as well as sustainable peace, security, and development. We extend our condolences to the DRC for their lives lost, into South Africa and Tanzania, who alongside Malawi have lost soldiers in this violence. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. Would like to welcome